Hey there, I'm Alex, this is Big Al Books, and today I'm going to tell you about all of the many things that I read in the month of May. May was a really exciting month for me because I moved into my new house at the start of the month, so to me, it just felt like a fresh new start. I just had this change of perspective, and also May was the month that spring really kicked off here, and it was so exciting watching new leaves appear on the trees. It just felt like every day kept getting more and more beautiful. So it was a very enjoyable month for me. So in terms of reading, I have quite a few books that I read for the Asian Readathon. Then I also finished one of my major reading projects for 2020, so that's very exciting. I tried doing some classic and contemporary reading pairings, and I also got through a few memoirs this month, so lots of different stuff that we have to talk about in this video. So let's start off with the things that I read for the Asian Readathon. I got through 10 books that can be counted towards this readathon, and luckily for me and the sake of the time of this video, I don't really have to talk about 7 of them in great depth because I made a reading vlog where I tried to get through all of these novellas over the course of the May 24th long weekend. These were all a bunch of novellas that were written in translation, and I had a very good time reading them over the weekend, so I'll link my video down below if you want more specific reviews. But if I were to go from best to worst, my favorite book that I read was Life for Sale by Yukio Mishima. It's about a man who decides that he doesn't want to live anymore, but after a failed suicide attempt, he decides to just hire his life out to anyone who wants to buy his services, and he just gets involved with all of these odd jobs. He meets these weird characters, and it was just very strange but very fun. My second favorite was The Factory by Hiroko Oyamada. This is a Japanese novella following the perspectives of 3 people who get new jobs at this place called The Factory. It's kind of like an office, but it's in its own isolated environment, and things just get progressively strange the longer that they continue to work there because weird things are happening around them, and they also feel like their jobs have absolutely no purpose. They really don't know what their role is in the organization. A lot of them are very unsupervised, and I feel like this book kind of asked some provocative questions about what the purpose of work is in the modern day world, and also this book is just heavily atmospheric. You really get lost in the world. Then my next favorite was Ghochar by Vivek Shanbhag. This was just a very entertaining story about a family. You just get a glimpse into their life, some of the problems that they're dealing with, and it was just very engaging. Then would be Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. I really liked how this book takes on so many sad and heavy themes, but does so in this strange upbeat kind of way. Then was Audition by Murakami, and this is about a widower who is looking to find a new wife, and he decides to try to find this perfect woman by hosting fake auditions for a TV show. So all of the women think that they're auditioning to be actresses on this show, but actually he's trying to scout them out to find his next new wife. He finds this woman, he's obsessed with her, but there are definitely some red flags. So this was a pretty fun one to burn through in an afternoon. Then was My Kind of Girl by Buddadeva Bose. This is a Bengali story about 4 men who get stuck overnight at a railway station, and they're really cold and they have nothing to do, so they just tell each other stories about their lost loves, and it was just kind of like a sweet, tender sort of novella. And then my least favorite thing that I read was Wind and Pinball, which are 2 early novellas by Haruki Murakami. Neither of these books had much plot to speak of, nor had Murakami really developed his signature writing voice, so both of these ones were just a bit of a miss for me. And then other things that I read throughout the month for the Asian Readathon, one of them was a short story collection. This is the Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. This is one I've had sitting on my shelf for way too long, but I'm so glad that I finally got to read this. Most of these stories are speculative in nature, so you get to read about cool things like going to outer space or traveling back to the past. However, what I thought was unique about this collection is that there's also a lot of Asian history interwoven into these stories. So I really liked how often at the end of a short story there would be an author's note where Ken Liu would explain a little bit more about the historical event that you just read about. So it was a great story collection because you're using your imagination so much and they're just really fun and engaging stories, but you are also learning a lot. And a lot of these historical events that he was writing about were things that I really didn't know a ton about. So this was a really special collection. I really loved the title story as well, The Paper Menagerie. That one just made me cry. I think it was a beautiful examination of the immigrant experience, and I really hope to teach that one someday. I also got around to reading the novel The Plotters by Eun-Soo Kim. This was translated from the Korean by Sora Kim Russell. This one came out last year and it was marketed as a literary thriller, but I didn't really find it to be either of those things, unfortunately. Like, this book was perfectly decent, but I think for a thriller you really have to grab the reader's excitement and interest, and it took me most of the month to read this thing because I just wasn't really that excited in finding out where the story was going. And it also wasn't as literary as I was expecting. Like, yes, the group of assassins work in a place called the library, but there isn't actually that much reflection on books. But yeah, this book is just kind of exploring the morally ambiguous world of professional assassins, and it was an entertaining read, just not really as cool as I was hoping it was going to be. On the final day of the month, I was also able to squeeze in one more read to count for this readathon, and that is The Subtweet by Vivek Shreya. And this was a really addictive read. Like I said, I read most of it in one day, just got completely sucked into the story, and this one is about two female musicians who form a friendship with each other. One of them, Neela, is kind of a more established musician. She's very serious about her craft, and she has this kind of small but loyal cult fan base, but she's never really made it big until one day this other musician, Rukmini, decides to cover her song, and the cover goes viral on the internet. The two end up meeting, they form a friendship, and then things get complicated as Rukmini becomes more and more successful. And then Neela decides to make a controversial subtweet on the internet. And after that tweet, both their friendships and their careers are completely altered. So like I mentioned, this is a really fun and addictive read. You will want to know what's going to happen to these two girls, but it also asks a lot of compelling questions about finding success in the digital age, how cultural appropriation is used in pop music, and also how sometimes the internet is so eager to build people up and yet even more eager to tear someone down for finding their behavior problematic. So this is a fascinating critique on cancel culture and how it sometimes gets turned around on the people it's supposed to be protecting. So it's a whirlwind of a book, but I think it's a great one if you're looking for something fun to read this summer. Moving on to the other books that I read this month, I actually had a huge reading accomplishment in the month of May, and that is I finished Proust's In Search of Lost Time. This is a project that I started back in the month of January. I was trying to pace myself and just read one volume per month. I originally planned on finishing in June. However, I've since decided to only read books by Indigenous authors in June, so I knew I had to try to bust through these last two volumes in May, and it was quite a challenge. I mean, this is a lot of Proust to kind of get through in 1 month, but man, this was just such an epic reading experience. Now, I know that I am not able to just wrap up an iconic series like In Search of Lost Time casually in a wrap-up like this. It will have to be a video of its own, but what I can tell you is that this series is super time-consuming, but it is so worthwhile. Although it gets kind of difficult towards the end, especially making it through volume 5, The Captive and the Fugitive. This is by far the longest volume of the series, and it just seems like the most repetitive of the books because the narrator is just kind of in emotional agony. So in the first half of the book, he's just like extremely jealous, and then he's extremely sad in the second half of the book. So this was the toughest one to get through, but luckily we had a strong finish because Time Regained was one of my favorite books in the series, and it does a great job of tying the project together where you really understand what Proust was trying to accomplish with this work. It is so epic in scale, and this book was a very triumphant finish to the series. So these were incredible reads, and I hope at some point in the summer I can make a video talking about why I found this to be such a valuable reading experience. Another book that I read was Watership Down by Richard Adams. This is a book about bunnies, and I immensely enjoyed it. I picked this one up to celebrate the start of spring because at the start of the month we were having really nice weather, so I decided to only ever read this book while I was outside, you know, so I could like commune with nature like the rabbits. But then actually got really cold in May and it was like snowing and then I was worried I wouldn't be able to finish this one. but luckily the weather got good again by the end of the month, so I was able to read this one entirely outside, which was a joyous experience. So this is a book about a pack of rabbits. One of them has clairvoyant abilities, and he has this vision where he thinks that the rabbits need to pack up and leave their warren because something dangerous is going to happen, and most of the rabbits don't believe him, but some of them do, and it is about that small group of rabbits that leaves home and they have to start entirely over again. And man, this book is just about struggle. Like, it is just one conflict after the next. These bunnies are never really safe. There's always something treacherous lurking around the corner. But something that I thought was really impressive about this book is how quickly I cared about them. Like, very early on, I was invested, I was worried for them. So, you know, this book caused me a lot of anxiety, but it was a really fun read. I also like how Richard Adams brought in his own kind of like mythology for the rabbits. They had their own stories that they tell each other and their own kind of spiritual beliefs, and I thought that that added a really neat extra dimension to this story. So this was a book that, like, I was surprised that I had never read it in my childhood because I was definitely aware of it, but I'm glad that I finally fixed that by getting around to it this month because this was just a wonderful read. And then next up, I have two sets of books that are classic and contemporary pairings. The first group of books all has to do with Beowulf. So I read the poem for the first time. This is the bilingual edition, and this was translated by Seamus Heaney. I realized very early on in this one that I have zero comprehension of Old English, so I was definitely just reading the modern side of the page, but you know, it is cool kind of seeing the like early origins of the language, how far we've come, you know, it makes Shakespeare look easy in comparison, and I was surprised at how fun I found this poem to be. I was a little worried that this was going to be boring. I thought I would kind of have to force myself to just read 20 pages every night to get through this, but then my first night reading this, I got through half of the poem in one sitting. I got so drawn into the story, so it was more fun than I was expecting. However, after that, I kind of lost my momentum, and it took me a lot more time to get through the second half of the poem, so what I would recommend doing is trying to read the whole thing in one night. I think that would have been a really fun experience. Rather, the second half just felt kind of anticlimactic after the first one. I feel like all the good stuff goes down in the like Grendel and the Grendel's mom part of the story. But yeah, this is just really engaging for such an old text. It is a good adventure story. You have a strange hero at the heart of all of this. He remains quite mysterious throughout the whole book, and there's just a lot of action going on. So I did quite enjoy Beowulf. And then I read two contemporary novels that are kind of retellings of Beowulf. One of them is Grendel by John Gardner, and I loved this book. I thought it was so creative, and it was kind of funny in some moments, and it was sad and poignant, and it was just remarkable. So this is obviously taking the perspective of Grendel, who is viewed as the monster in Beowulf because he's coming down and slaughtering everyone in the hall at their feasts. And this book gives you a lot more context into who Grendel might have been, and you get to see what his life was like before humans ever showed up. So I feel like in this book, you're not just examining the perspective of the monster, but you're also examining what humans are, because Grendel is trying to piece together his understanding of these people. So he's trying to work on understanding language and poetry and music, religion, the role of a hero. So I kind of like how this book is about Grendel, but it's actually holding up the mirror to the rest of humanity. So very big stuff going on in this book. There is also a chilling moment in this book where Grendel meets up with the dragon, who is fated to have a final battle with Beowulf. And it turns out dragons like don't see time in a linear fashion, so he like knows everything that has happened and will happen. It was just like such a strange moment to be in the center of this book, and it was super haunting. So there's a lot of powerful stuff going on in this text. I would love to read it again because even though it's short, there is just a whole world of ideas going on in this story. And then a more recent contemporary retelling of Beowulf that I read was The Mere Wife by Maria Devana Headley. This book has been pitched as Beowulf in the Suburbs because instead of taking place at a king's feasting hall, this is set in an exclusive gated community filled with these affluent, perfect families. However, there is a dark and ominous mountain that is lurking behind this community, and that's where we meet the Grendel's mother figure. Her name is Dana, and in this story, she is a heavily traumatized army veteran. She doesn't have the firmest grip on the past. She was taken hostage by the other side in the war, and she became pregnant, and she comes home and has her baby and decides that humans are monsters, and she doesn't want her kid living anywhere near other people, so she raises him alone in this cave. And it kind of flips back and forth between these perspectives. So you've got Dana doing her thing up on the mountain, and then you've got the perfect world of moms and wives that are living down below in the community. And of course, there wouldn't be a story if their two worlds didn't totally collide on each other. So this was a very fun and creative reimagining, and it was also decently suspenseful. Like, there were a lot of intense things that happened, and it did make for quite a page-turning read. So I'm really impressed with how Headley was able to bring the story into a modern context in a way that was really fun and imaginative, but also in a way that just really made sense. So this was another cool retelling. I guess the lesson here is that Beowulf retellings are pretty solid, because I enjoyed both of them. The next classic and contemporary pairing that I did was rereading Howard's End by E.M. Forster, and then checking out Zadie Smith's On Beauty. So I actually just read Howard's End for the first time back in September, which feels like a lifetime ago, but I guess was only like a few months ago. And I feel like I really messed up with this book because it didn't make it on my favorite books of 2019 list. And having reread it now, like, I feel like this is one of my favorite books of all time. So I'm just trying to understand what the heck happened, why I didn't realize that I love this book so much on the first read through, but I'm so glad I picked it up again. It is a joy. There's just so much wisdom and wonder on every page, and I just love the characters in this story. Like, the two sisters are just so much fun. They're these intellectual sisters, and they're kind of these do-gooders, you know, they want to make the world a better place, but they don't know how to go about it. They each have their own theories, and they both make a lot of mistakes throughout the book, so I love that. They're not these perfect, saintly women. They do get things wrong, and I feel like there's a lot that everyone can learn from this book. And I feel like that's why this book is still so relevant, because we're still trying to figure these things out. We want to make the world less of a horrible, oppressive, unjust place, but we don't really have the answers, and we kind of just fumble along in our personal lives, and sometimes we hurt the people that we're trying to help because you don't know what the consequences of your actions are going to be. But ultimately, it's about people who have different philosophies, different mindsets, trying to live together in a harmonious way, and I think this book is just such a complex, beautiful depiction of this in life in all of its messy detail, so I love the hell out of this thing. And again, I'm just so confused why I didn't know that I loved this thing much sooner, but glad that I took the time to reread this one. And then at the same time that I was reading Howard's End, I was also reading On Beauty by Zadie Smith. It was really fun to read these books side by side because On Beauty has a lot of very direct references to Howard's End, so I was glad to have that story kind of fresh in my mind so I could appreciate the connections. And this one is just about a family who is kind of struggling. So the parents in this family are kind of at this midlife crisis moment, and they don't really know if they're going to be able to make their marriage work. And you just get the sense that these parents are coming from very different identities, which puts their children in this interesting position because they have to navigate both of those worlds. So the father, Howard, is a white English college professor, and the mother, Kiki, is a black woman from Florida, and there's just so much tension between these two people. And I think this book does a good job of exploring how people change throughout their lives, and it's kind of unrealistic to expect the person that you fell in love with as a young person to stay the same throughout all of their lives. After all of their changes and disappointments, you kind of become this different person sometimes in middle age, and you might not be compatible anymore. So I thought this book did a good job of depicting those tensions while still just being a very entertaining read. You also get to find out what's going on in the lives of the children and other professors who are working in this college. There is a classic rival family in here, kind of like in Howard's End. So I think that this book did a very effective job of moving the story of Howard's End into a more contemporary setting, and I just really enjoy Zadie Smith's writing style. I think she's witty, I think she's observant, and it is very fun to make your way through one of her stories. I was also able to make my way through 3 Shakespeare plays this month, One of them was Two Noble Kinsmen. This one isn't usually counted as a canonical Shakespeare work since it was co-authored with John Fletcher, and yeah, I didn't think that this was one of his strongest plays. However, I did watch the Globe's production of it when it was available on YouTube, and I thought they made the story seem really fun, and I liked their diverse casting, so that brought more joy into the story. I definitely enjoyed seeing it performed more than I did reading through the text by myself. And then I also read another Shakespeare play that people believe was co-authored with someone else, and that one was Timman of Athens, and this was a strange one. This is one of his tragedies, but definitely not one of the well-known ones. It's a very satirical tale, and it's about a man who is just extremely generous. When we see him at the start of his play, he is just giving away so much money and food and precious valuables to his friends, and then it turns out he's actually in some financial trouble and he needs some help from those friends, and he finds out that they're all fake and they don't want to help him out and return the generosity, and he just has some kind of like mental breakdown after this. He just becomes totally misanthropic, he turns on society, and he flees to the wilderness. So this is a weird play in terms of tonal shift. Obviously the man you meet at the end of the play is nothing like the guy you met at the beginning, but I kind of liked watching him become more and more unhinged and having these outbursts and yelling at people. So like, it's a chaotic play. But there was something that was weirdly fascinating about it, and I think it could be fun to see a staged version of this, to like watch this person become progressively unhinged. So it's a weird one. I can see why it's not more well known, but it was still worth checking out. And then I got to Measure for Measure, which I thought was going to be a good time comedy, and no, I did not walk into this play knowing what it was going to be about, but dang, this one is heavy for one of the comedies. It's about a deputy named Angelo who has been hired by a duke to watch over his city while he leaves, and this man Angelo thinks that the city has become totally corrupt, and he thinks that people have lost their moral values, so he plans on having very strict punishments for anyone who disobeys his rules, especially anyone who gets involved in any kind of sexual misconduct. But then, of course, the big gag of this play is that Angelo is a huge hypocrite himself. But it's not a funny kind of hypocrite, it's like a very dark form of hypocrite, because he ends up threatening this young woman who's trying to save her brother's life, and it just like things got real in this play. Like I feel like this book was really relevant, especially all the discussions that have been happening these past few years with the Me Too movement and how all too often people who have power like this abuse it. So this one was really heavy, and it felt really weird to go from like these intense scenes into the like jokesy comic relief Shakespeare comedy kind of scenes. So like again, the tonal shifts in this play were very strange. So my first impression of this play is that it is very complex. There are a lot of issues being explored in here, but I think it was well done because I did find myself being very invested in the story and what was going to happen to the characters. So this is one I know I will have to read again to get a better grip on it, but I think this one deserves more attention in the Shakespeare canon. It is a fascinating play, and it didn't really feel like any of his other works, so really glad I checked that one out this month. And then finally, to wrap up this video, I have a few works of nonfiction to talk about. One of them is a biography, Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley by Charlotte Gordon. I wanted to pick this one up because May is the month of Mother's Day, and I thought it would be cool to get through this mother-daughter biography, and this was excellent. I think this was so well crafted. This biography is told in alternating chapters, so you get a little bit of information about Mary Wollstonecraft's life, and then you learn about what's going on in her daughter's life. And I feel like that's a hard trick to pull off because you need to make both biographies feel equally compelling. Otherwise it's going to seem boring, you know, if you're only interested in reading about Mary Shelley. But I think she did a great job of bringing excitement to both of their life stories that made you interested. I feel like this was kind of a page turner. Like both of these women went through so much in their personal lives, not to even get into their professional lives, but there was just so much drama that happened, so it was really engaging to read that way. But I also like how Gordon is trying to deal with their historical legacy, so both of these women had to put up with a lot of flack in their own everyday lives because of their writing. But she also explores how their works have been perceived in different periods of time, and she's trying to clear away a lot of the myth and misconception that has clouded a lot of scholarship around the works of these two women, and she's just trying to present it for how groundbreaking and radical a lot of it was for its time. So this was a really enjoyable biography. I think it's worth checking out even if you're not a particular fan of either of these writers. This is just a very interesting feminist look on this period back in history. You'll learn a lot, and I think you will be a fan of these two by the end after reading this. And then I read 3 memoirs this month, 2 of which were on audio. I definitely relied on some good audiobooks this month because, like I mentioned, I moved and I had a lot of unpacking to do. So it was really nice to just listen to a memoir, have someone tell me their life story. It was a great way to pass the time. So the first memoir that I listened to was Hart Berries by Therese Marie Mayo. She's from the Seabird Island band, and this is just a very honest and unflinching kind of memoir. And what I found really interesting about this memoir is that Therese is trying to write against the stereotype of what an Indigenous woman's memoir should read like. She doesn't want to play into the stereotypes. She doesn't want to present her trauma in a way that people would be expecting to see it. So it was really interesting to see how she was writing about her own pain and difficult experiences, but trying to do so in a fresh, honest, and original kind of way. So it was a really compelling memoir, and I think it's one that I'm going to have to read again on paper so I can pay more attention to the craft, because Mayo is a very intentional writer, and I think that she is a very new and exciting upcoming voice in Indigenous writing. And then the second memoir that I listened to on audio this month was Sing Backwards and Weep by Mark Lanegan. So if you haven't heard of Mark Lanegan, he is a singer from Seattle, kind of around that famous 90s grunge period. And fun fact, Mark Lanegan was my high school crush. What drew me to Mark is his iconic voice.
Are those halos in your hair, or diamonds shining there?
He has this low, deep, smoky, whiskey-soaked kind of voice, and his singing, you kind of feel it as a rumble in your stomach more than you do actually hear it. I just love everything about his voice, and he narrated this audiobook, so that was extremely exciting for me. Usually when I'm listening to an audiobook, I'll speed that up to 1.5 or more. This one, no, I had to listen to it just as it was because Mark's voice is just perfection. So I was so excited about this book that I actually signed up for Audible to get my free credit to use on this book, because I don't like supporting Amazon, so I don't really want an Audible account for the rest of the year, but I just had to listen to this book, and it was so worth it. What I really liked about this book is that it was not your traditional rock star memoir where they're trying to convince you that they were really cool and they did so much partying. Rather, this book is really haunted. Apparently Lanegan was dealing with a lot of inner demons when he wrote this book. He had to write it quickly because it was bringing him to such a dark place, and he is experiencing so much guilt about the things that he did in the past, and he's not trying to glamorize that past. He comes across as a pretty rough person. He's dealing with a lot of issues, especially in regards to addiction. He's not trying to make himself into a hero, and he has a lot of regrets about how he handled different friendships and different situations. So it was really a harrowing memoir in a lot of ways. But I think that it is really cool that Lanegan was able to be so direct and honest and unflinching. It made for a really compelling listening experience. Of course, I would recommend this on audio because this story just completely becomes transformed when you have Lanegan's gravelly voice telling it to you. So this is one of my best reading experiences of the year so far. It was totally worth the wait and totally worth using my one free Audible credit. This one was a really impressive read. So I ended up picking up another rock memoir that I've wanted to read for a while, and that one is I Live Inside, Memoirs of a Babe in Toyland by Michelle Leon. As you can see on here, she was the bass player in a band called Babes in Toyland, who are a very aggressive and powerful female rock trio. They were definitely an important formative influence on me when I was a teenage girl because they just rocked harder than anyone in the game. So it was such a treat for me to get to see more of an inside look about what it was like to be in that band, in that kind of time period. What was it like to be a female musician working in an industry that is notoriously sexist? So Michelle Leon did a good job of spilling the tea in her memoir, but not really spilling too much. I feel like she didn't give away too much juicy personal drama in here. I thought this was very well crafted. The only thing that I didn't love about this book is that Michelle would interrupt the narrative by including these brief vignette flashbacks to the past, and they were written in second person narrative, which I just don't tend to enjoy in memoirs usually, so I found those were kind of clunky and they didn't really add much to the narrative. So I could have lived without those sections, but ultimately I got what I wanted from this book, which was a great glimpse about what it was like to be a member of Babes in Toyland. So that is it for all the books that I read in the month of May. I'd love to know if you have any comments or questions or thoughts about these books, so please leave me a comment down below if you are so inclined. I always love hearing from everyone. Let me know if you've read something fantastic recently. And thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you again later. Take care. Goodbye.